And now I would like to invite Hans Jakob Agotnes, also from the University of Bergen, who will speak about two aspects of things, about the thing as an object, as a sign, and materiality.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I will try to say something about museum objects too, but I'm afraid what I'm going to say is a bit more abstract than Knut's presentation. I'm going to discuss the relation between the significativity and the materiality of objects, and especially museum objects. We could ask, does the object speak? Well, yes, it does. Henrik has already assured us that museum objects speak. But we could also ask, how do they speak? And I want to start with an old story about the material, which impressed me many years ago. The historian Fernand Braudel gives an example of the impact of the material on people in his Capitalism and Material Life, 1400 to 1800. There he discusses the way the Chinese furnished their living rooms. He notes that in China they used two types of furniture. Low furniture, based on sitting on the floor, and high furniture, based on the chair, which was an import from Europe, probably, which became common in China in the 9th century. The chair required the use of high furniture, like high tables and high cupboards. But earlier, the way of furnishing living rooms in China was based on the low table, chests for storing things, and so on. So they had this lower level of the room with the high chairs and high tables, and then they had a raised part of the room, a platform, this height, with the low furniture and with cushions and mats and so on. Braudel's point is that this arrangement implied two ways of life. On the one hand, seated life, squatting with the legs crossed. And on the other hand, sitting on chairs. The one was used in the family, in the intimate atmosphere of the family, and the other was used more officially when people had guests. And he notes that these two types of behavior were almost two different biologies. And his point is that these two types of being in the world characterized different parts of the world. So that in some parts people were squatting, in other parts they were sitting like we sit now. In other words, the furniture impacts our habits and leaves its imprint on our bodily movements and postures. We could also say that it shaped the habitus of people living in different parts of the world. This analysis of Braudel was conceived in a theoretical framework of material culture, or like what he called material civilization. But it could easily be understood in the perspective of actor network analysis too. The piece of furniture acts upon the humans who change their behavior to interact with their surroundings. They could also be understood in a phenomenological framework, stressing the bodily existence in a material environment. But I think that there is also a non-material aspect of this story. The original Chinese name for the chair, a name which is still in use, means barbaric bed. And of course there are a lot of difficult problems in translation involved here. But if this expression in Chinese has similar connotations that the English one has for us, the symbolic aspect is not without interest. They called it a bed probably because they had no concept of a chair. So bed was the most fitting idea of a type of furniture that they could use. And barbaric probably just meant foreign, but they had some ideas which placed this piece of furniture in their cultural mapping of reality. The so-called material turn has given us a new awareness of the importance of the material world. It has also launched a critique of other perspectives on the grounds that they see objects merely as signs, as communicating meaning, while their material impact is neglected. As I see it, we should not be fundamentalist towards these perspectives. They are just perspectives. They are not depictions of reality, but they are perspectives which allows us to see some connections in this reality, and then we will not see other connections. So they are perspectives which are more or less fruitful for understanding given phenomena. We should treat them not as theories about reality is like, but as methodological devices to solve specific problems. But all perspectives do not fit every purpose. To investigate reality, we choose the most relevant perspectives. Above all, if we want to understand the role of museum objects, we should not abandon the idea of their signifying function. What do we mean when we talk about the material? There is a big discussion about this, and I don't want to engage in that discussion, but I want to note that usually in material studies there is another concept involved, and that concept is practice. So very often, if we look at studies of everyday life, or if we look at the so-called science and technology studies, we will see that the material objects and structures that are involved are analyzed when they engaged in practices. And then we have a relation between objects and human actors. And one very good idea which we find in this actor network theory is that we should not separate subjects from objects. We should treat both the human actors and the objects as objects. which are actors engaging in relations in networks. And we can see many interesting things here. For example, how people in China earlier were their way of living were formed by their material environment. But I would make the further note that the material is characterized not only by its materiality, but also by significativity. It is communicating meaning. Many scholars want to blur this distinction and not talk about materiality on the one side and significativity on the other, but I don't think that this is apt in all situations. Even if it may be a useful perspective, when we talk about museum objects, we should not forget the meaningful or symbolic function of objects. We will not be able to forget the meaning objects have for us, and this meaning is founded in what we know about the objects beforehand. So objects may influence us by their materiality, by their sheer materiality, but they will also always mean something to us. And this is generally not denied by materiality theorists, but I think that it's worth noting that we have to take this perspective also with us. Some researchers would say that material culture is not, material culture studies should not conceive of the material as sheer matter. Most often, the material or the objects and structures we talk about is about structured material, for example, in the form of technology. And in this field of science and technology studies, we see that, well, the material could be, for example, the radio broadcasting system, which is a materiality that allows for communication, but one-way communication. If we talk about the materiality of the internet, for example, this would be another kind of materiality that works in another way. So the material is usually what people have prepared for taking part in practices. And as such, the material have inscribed an instrumentality. The material that we talk about when we engage with the material as human beings is objects and structures that is intended for certain uses, for example. And this is particularly important when it comes to museum objects, in my opinion. So the point I want to make regarding museum objects is that for visitors, the museum is a type of materiality or a material structure that is different from the materiality of our daily lives. it's a special form of engaging with the material which gives priority to seeing. In exhibitions, museum objects are staged with a certain intention, and it is staged by museum curators, by you. The intention to signify is, so to speak, objectified in museum objects. They are meant to represent, and the represented meaning is primarily meant to be perceived through the eye. This is also the perspective of visitors who enter the museums. The museum objects are seen by visitors on the presupposition of a corresponding expectation. When we visit a museum, we are looking for this kind of represented meaning. We presuppose that there is a represented meaning in objects. This is perhaps a secondary level of material presence, which affects the balance between the exhibited objects' materiality and their significativity. So the museum object is, in my view, not part of everyday life. On the contrary, it is removed from our everyday practices, and that is a characteristic of the objects when they have been placed on display in museums. It is there with the underlying intention of communicating. It is still material, of course, but the balance is tipped toward representation. We enter the museum with the attitude of contemplation. We are there to watch and reflect on what the exhibited objects mean. And this is the effect of the museum concept itself. Further, we could say that the techniques of exhibition contributes to the focus on meaning. The selection and arrangement of objects, the contexts for interpretation that accompany them, for example, texts, guide our reception of exhibitions. And no text telling us what an object is would also be a guide to meaning, perhaps leading to an aesthetic interpretation. The situation is another if we think of the museum objects as part of collections. If we are not studying what happens when museum objects are on display and tell a story, if we look at the museum collection, we could perhaps more aptly use a materialistic perspective. Then the interaction with museum personnel is perhaps more like the everyday practices, and a material perspective could be appropriate. It can, of course, be a part of the curator's intention to give priority to the exhibited object's material characteristics, but it would still, in my opinion, take place within the museum setting where objects are staged for contemplation. Most fundamentally, I think that visitors have their knowledge of objects with them when they get into the museum. What the curators can do is stage the way objects meet visitors in such a way that they actualize certain lines of interpretation. Visitors also bring their concept of the museum with them, the concept of the museum itself, which includes the expectation that objects are there, first and foremost, to represent meaning. And this meaning is, in many ways and in many museums organized in the form of science or academic disciplines. So I would say that, for example, after geology has conceptualized nature's minerals, it has been made meaningful according to a knowledge system. We are not able to think away this knowledge. The minerals will signify it, even if everyday existence will also inform us of their meaning. So this is an argument for not seeing only the material side of objects, and especially not in museums. We should not forget old insights from analysis of the way museum objects communicate and establishes meaning. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone would like to ask a question? Jakieś pytania chcielibyście Państwo zadać? Okay, so one brief comment. Thank you for this. It's our trouble how to balance between the materiality of the object and the meaning that is always involved somehow. And I have found at least one thing common in these two first presentations. It's about the everyday life object that becomes something more in the museum frame. And it's not very optimistic for us because we try to give somehow, by some meanings, to our object the status of everyday life thing. So my question would be, have you ever seen any exhibition or any museum that tries to do so, to show the everyday life object as it is, as it was when it was still functioning in these complex relations of things and people?
I'm not quite sure if I understand your question, but I would say that as everyday objects, we all have intimate knowledge of these objects beforehand. And therefore this life knowledge will guide our way of perceiving the objects, much more than if they were relatively unknown objects. So that was my main point, that we cannot think away what we know about the objects. They cannot, I think, speak to us solely as materiality.
Thank you.